They thought I was just another desk clerk they could push around and humiliate. When Officer Garrett Lynch grabbed a fistful of my hair in front of the entire squad room, laughing as he called me sweetheart, he had no idea I was internal affairs. That single act of arrogance would unravel an entire precinct's culture of corruption and cost him everything he thought he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The unmarked sedan rolled to a stop outside Summitview Police Department's Northridge Precinct just after dawn. I sat in the passenger seat for a moment, studying the squat brick building that would be my workplace for the next several months. The structure looked tired, with faded paint around the window frames and a parking lot full of potholes that nobody had bothered to repair. It wasn't the gleaming headquarters downtown where promotions were made and careers were built. This was where problem officers got transferred, and ambitious cops came to die slow professional deaths. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing down my plain gray slacks and adjusting the uncomfortable polyester blazer that completed my civilian administrative assistant costume. My hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, my face free of makeup, my entire appearance designed to be forgettable. The badge and service weapon that had been part of my identity for 8 years were locked away in a safe deposit box across town. For the foreseeable future, I was just Kendall Brooks, temporary administrative support staff, hired through a temp agency to help with filing and data entry. The reality was far different. I was Detective Kendall Brooks, Internal Affairs Division, with 12 years on the force and a sterling record of rooting out corruption in 3 different precincts. My specialty was going undercover in departments that raised red flags, embedding myself where no one would think to look twice, and documenting the rot from the inside. Northridge Precinct had been flagged 6 months ago after a pattern of civilian complaints, use of force incidents, and suspicious evidence handling had caught the attention of the commissioner's office. The glass door slid open with a pneumatic hiss as I entered the precinct. The lobby smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A bored-looking officer sat behind bulletproof glass at the front desk, barely glancing up from his phone as I approached. "Help you?" he mumbled. "I'm Kendall Brooks," I said, keeping my voice soft and uncertain. "I'm supposed to start today as an administrative assistant, temp assignment, through Metro Staffing?" He finally looked up, his eyes doing a quick scan that felt more judgmental than professional. "Yeah, they mentioned something about that. Hold on." He picked up a phone, pressed a few buttons, and spoke in a tone that suggested I was already an inconvenience. "Lieutenant Shepard, your temp is here." 5 minutes later, a woman in her mid-40s appeared through a security door. Lieutenant Diana Shepard had the kind of face that suggested she'd spent years perfecting the art of looking perpetually annoyed. Her dark hair was cut in a severe bob, and her uniform was pressed to razor-sharp creases that somehow made her seem more intimidating than welcoming. "You're the temp?" she asked, looking me up and down with undisguised skepticism. "Yes, ma'am. Kendall Brooks." "Follow me." She turned without waiting to see if I complied. I grabbed my shoulder bag and hurried after her through the security door. The interior of the precinct was a maze of cramped corridors, outdated equipment, and bulletin boards covered in memos that nobody probably read. Officers moved through the hallways with the casual swagger of people who knew they owned their territory. Most didn't even glance at me as we passed. The few who did gave me the kind of dismissive once-over reserved for janitors and delivery people.
"Yes, ma'am?" Lieutenant Shepard studied me for another moment, and I kept my expression neutral and slightly intimidated. This was the critical moment when people formed their first impression. She needed to see someone harmless, someone forgettable, someone who posed absolutely no threat to the established order. "The restroom is down the hall to the left. Break room is on the 2nd floor. You get 30 minutes for lunch. Don't be late." Without another word, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. I stood alone in the cramped office, surrounded by years of accumulated paperwork and the faint smell of old coffee and dust. Slowly, I set my bag down on the assigned desk and surveyed my new domain. This was exactly where I needed to be. In the background, invisible, with access to every report, every incident file, every piece of documentation that flowed through Northridge Precinct. Through the open door, I could hear the squad room coming to life as the day shift arrived. Voices called out greetings, someone laughed at a joke I couldn't hear, a phone rang persistently until someone finally answered it. This was the ecosystem I needed to understand, not as an authority figure who would make everyone careful and guarded, but as part of the furniture, so unremarkable that people would forget I was even there. I pulled out the desk chair, which squeaked in protest, and sat down. The computer was ancient, probably running software from a decade ago. The stacks of files on the desk were in no particular order. Someone had started several different organizing systems and abandoned all of them partway through. It would take weeks just to sort through this mess, which was fine. It gave me cover and access. From my bag, I pulled out a small notebook with a plain black cover. To anyone who glanced at it, it would look like a personal planner or diary. In reality, it was my case log, where I would document everything I observed, every incident, every interaction that raised red flags. The notebook was encrypted with a simple code that looked like personal shorthand but would be intelligible to my handler in internal affairs. On the first page, I wrote the date and a single line. Day 1, Northridge Precinct. Initial impression, neglect and institutional contempt evident in physical space and command structure. A voice from the doorway made me look up. "You must be the new temp." A woman in her early 30s stood there, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the same kind of plainclothes civilian employee outfit I had on. Her name tag identified her as Jenna Flores. She had kind eyes and a tired smile that suggested she'd been working in this environment long enough to know exactly how hostile it could be. "Kendall," I said, standing up and extending my hand. "Kendall Brooks." "Jenna Flores. I handle evidence intake and logging." She shook my hand and gestured at the chaos around us. "Welcome to the glamorous world of Northridge administrative support. Hope you brought your sense of humor, because you're going to need it around here." "That bad?" I asked, allowing a note of concern to creep into my voice. Jenna glanced over her shoulder, then stepped fully into the office and lowered her voice. "Let's just say the officers here aren't always thrilled about civilian staff. They tend to see us as either servants or obstacles. My advice? Keep your head down, do your work, don't offer opinions about anything, and definitely don't try to be helpful beyond what you're specifically asked to do. The less you're noticed, the better." It was advice that aligned perfectly with my mission, though probably not in the way Jenna intended. "Thanks for the warning." "Don't mention it. Literally don't mention I said anything." She smiled, but there was genuine nervousness behind it. "Come on, I'll show you how the filing system works, such as it is." As Jenna began explaining the precinct's organizational chaos, I listened carefully and asked simple questions. But my attention was also tracking the sounds from the squad room, the voices, the interactions, the culture that was already revealing itself in 1,000 small ways. Somewhere out there was Officer Garrett Lynch, the name that had come up most frequently in the civilian complaints that had triggered this investigation. I hadn't seen him yet, but I knew from his file that he was a 10-year veteran, well-liked by his fellow officers, and seemingly untouchable despite a pattern of aggressive behavior that should have resulted in discipline years ago. I also knew that in environments like this, the worst behavior rarely stayed hidden for very long. Give it time, stay invisible, and the truth would reveal itself. What I didn't know yet was just how brutally and publicly that revelation would come.
My first week at Northridge Precinct passed in a blur of filing, data entry, and careful observation. The work itself was mind-numbingly tedious, exactly the kind of administrative drudgery that made most officers' eyes glaze over when they thought about it, which was precisely why it was perfect for my purposes. While my hands sorted through incident reports and case files, my mind was cataloging patterns, inconsistencies, and red flags that painted a troubling picture of how this precinct actually operated. The physical space told its own story. Equipment requests that languished for months, broken security cameras in the evidence room that nobody seemed in any hurry to repair,
A use of force report filed by an officer named Cassidy that had somehow never made it into the digital system, buried instead in a filing cabinet behind outdated supply requisitions. Small things individually, but collectively, they suggested an environment where accountability was treated as optional. But it was the culture, the daily interactions and unspoken rules that revealed the deeper rot. Officers moved through the precinct with an entitlement that bordered on contempt for anyone outside their inner circle. Civilian employees like Jenna and me were treated as barely visible servants, expected to materialize when needed and disappear when not. The few female officers I'd seen kept their heads down and stayed quiet. Their body language suggested they'd learned not to draw attention to themselves. My second Monday at Northridge was when I first encountered Officer Garrett Lynch. I was in the break room, refilling the coffee maker because someone had emptied it and left the pot dirty, when a group of officers came in from their shift. 3 men in uniform, all in their early 30s, carrying themselves with the casual confidence of people who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. The one in the lead had sandy blonde hair, cut military short, a strong jawline, and the kind of athletic build that suggested he spent considerable time in the gym. His name tag read Lynch, and everything about his bearing screamed alpha male. The 2 officers flanking him, Wilcox and Cassidy, according to their tags, watched him with the attentiveness of followers waiting for their leader's cue. "Coffee ready?" Lynch asked, not looking at me directly, but clearly addressing me since I was the only other person in the room. "Just started a fresh pot," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Should be ready in a few minutes." "We don't have a few minutes," he said, his tone suggesting this was somehow my fault. "We've got briefing in 10. I turned to face him, keeping my expression apologetic. "I can bring a carafe to the briefing room once it's ready, if that would help." For the first time, Lynch actually looked at me. His eyes did a quick scan, and I saw the exact moment he categorized me as unimportant. "Don't bother. Just make sure it's ready next time before we come in here." "I'll keep that in mind," I said quietly. Lynch was already turning away, dismissing me as irrelevant. His buddies followed suit, and I heard Wilcox mutter something that made the others laugh as they left. I couldn't make out the words, but the contemptuous tone was clear enough. I finished setting up the coffee maker and pulled out my phone, pretending to check messages, while actually opening the encrypted notes app where I kept my observations. Lynch, Garrett, initial contact, displays entitlement behavior towards civilian staff. Associates, Wilcox and Cassidy. Group dynamics suggests tight-knit unit with established hierarchy. The incident was minor, barely worth noting in isolation, but I'd learned over the years that patterns revealed themselves through accumulated details. The way someone treated people they perceived as beneath them often predicted how they'd behave when they had real power over someone. By the end of my second week, I'd witnessed enough interactions to understand the precinct's social hierarchy. Captain Neil Townsend, the precinct commander, was rarely seen outside his office. When he did appear, he maintained a carefully cultivated distance from the daily operations, as if plausible deniability was a management strategy. Lieutenant Shepard ran the day shift with an iron fist, but her authorities seemed selective. She'd come down hard on minor infractions by junior officers while completely ignoring more serious issues from veteran officers like Lynch. The squad room was dominated by a core group of about 6 officers who'd been at Northridge for at least 7 years. Lynch was clearly the informal leader of this group, with Wilcox and Cassidy as his closest allies. They claimed the best desks, took the most desirable assignments, and seemed to operate with minimal supervision. Other officers either orbited around them seeking approval or stayed carefully out of their way.
"Did you see Townsend's memo about the new incident reporting requirements?" Wilcox asked. "We're supposed to file supplementary reports within 24 hours now." Lynch snorted. "Yeah, I saw it. Same as every other new policy they try to push. Give it 2 weeks and everyone will forget about it. That's how things work around here. The brass makes noise about accountability, we nod and smile, and then we keep doing our jobs the way they need to be done." What if someone actually tries to enforce it? Nobody's going to enforce anything. Townsend doesn't want to know the details of how we keep this neighborhood under control. He just wants the statistics to look good on his monthly reports. As long as arrest numbers stay up and complaints don't make it to the media, he's happy to let us handle things our way. Their footsteps moved away down the hallway, but I'd heard enough. I added the conversation to my notes along with the date and time. This was the attitude I'd been sent to document. Officers who believed they operated above oversight in an environment that had taught them there would be no consequences for that belief. Later that afternoon, I had my first direct negative interaction with Lynch. I was walking down the main corridor carrying a stack of files that needed to go to the captain's office. The stack was tall enough that I had to look around it to see where I was going. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with Lynch coming from the other direction. "Watch it," he snapped, even though he'd been walking just as carelessly. "Sorry," I said, automatically steadying the files. "You need to pay attention to where you're going. This isn't a library. We've got real work happening here." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Any response that showed backbone would be out of character for the role I was playing. But Lynch wasn't done. "What's your name again?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he'd never bothered to learn it in the first place. "Kendall Brooks." "Well, Kendall Brooks, maybe try to be a little more aware of your surroundings. Last thing we need is someone tripping over the help and getting injured on duty." He smirked at his own joke, and Cassidy, who'd been walking with him, laughed dutifully. They walked past, leaving me standing in the corridor with my stack of files and a burning awareness that this was only the beginning. Lynch had noticed me now, which meant I'd moved from invisible to target. In a culture like Northridge's, that transition rarely led anywhere good. Later that afternoon, I had my first direct negative interaction with Lynch. I was walking down the main corridor carrying a stack of files that needed to go to the captain's office. The stack was tall enough that I had to look around it to see where I was going. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with Lynch coming from the other direction. "Watch it," he snapped, even though he'd been walking just as carelessly. "Sorry," I said, automatically steadying the files. "You need to pay attention to where you're going. This isn't a library. We've got real work happening here." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Any response that showed backbone would be out of character for the role I was playing. But Lynch wasn't done. "What's your name again?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he'd never bothered to learn it in the first place. "Kendall Brooks." "Well, Kendall Brooks, maybe try to be a little more aware of your surroundings. Last thing we need is someone tripping over the help and getting injured on duty." He smirked at his own joke, and Cassidy, who'd been walking with him, laughed dutifully. They walked past, leaving me standing in the corridor with my stack of files and a burning awareness that this was only the beginning. Lynch had noticed me now, which meant I'd moved from invisible to target. In a culture like Northridge's, that transition rarely led anywhere good. That evening, alone in the records office, after most of the day shift had cleared out, I sat at my desk and reviewed my notes from the past 2 weeks. The picture they painted was consistent. A precinct where informal power structures had replaced formal accountability, where veteran officers operated with minimal oversight, and where anyone outside the dominant group learned quickly to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. Sergeant Raymond Polak, one of the older officers who mostly kept to himself, appeared in the doorway. He was in his mid-50s, with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much to be impressed by swagger and posturing. "Working late?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Just trying to catch up on filing. There's a lot of backlog." He studied me for a moment. "I've been on the force 28 years, worked at 6 different precincts. You know what I've learned?" I shook my head. "The places with the most discipline problems are always the ones where people forget that the badge comes with responsibility, not just authority." He paused. "You seem like someone who pays attention. Keep your eyes open." Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me with the distinct impression that Sergeant Raymond Polak suspected there was more to me than my cover story suggested. That was concerning, but also potentially useful. In every corrupt environment, there were usually a few people who recognized the problems, but felt powerless to address them alone. I locked my desk drawer and gathered my things to leave. Outside the precinct windows, the sun was setting over Summitview, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere in the city were the civilians who'd filed complaints about Officer Lynch and others like him. People who'd encountered abuse of authority and been dismissed or ignored when they tried to report it. My job was to make sure their voices were finally heard. But first, I needed to see exactly how bad things were at Northridge. And based on what I'd observed in just 2 weeks, I suspected I'd barely scratched the surface.
By my 4th week at Northridge Precinct, the pattern of disrespect had evolved into something more deliberate and targeted. What started as casual dismissal had become systematic harassment, and Officer Garrett Lynch was leading the charge with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a new source of entertainment. It began with small things. Files I'd carefully organized would be scattered across my desk when I returned from lunch, with no explanation or apology. Coffee I'd made for the break room would be dumped out and replaced with a note reading, "Too weak," even though I'd followed the exact measurements posted on the wall. Equipment I needed for data entry would mysteriously disappear, only to turn up hours later in random locations around the precinct. None of it was overtly aggressive. Each incident could be dismissed as accident or coincidence, but the cumulative effect was clear. Someone wanted me to know I wasn't welcome, and they wanted me to feel constantly off balance and uncertain. The harassment escalated during a morning briefing in my 5th week. Lieutenant Shepard was reviewing arrest statistics when she mentioned that several incident reports from the previous month were still missing digital entries. She looked directly at me, standing near the back of the briefing room, where I'd been setting up the projection equipment. "Brooks, you're supposed to be handling data entry. Why are we still finding paper reports that haven't been entered into the system?" I kept my voice calm and professional. "Ma'am, I've been working through the backlogs systematically. There were over 300 reports that hadn't been entered when I started. I'm about halfway through them now." "Halfway isn't finished," she said sharply. "This is basic administrative work. How hard can it be?" Before I could respond, Lynch's voice cut through the room. "Maybe we hired the wrong temp agency. Some people just aren't cut out for attention to detail." Laughter rippled through the assembled officers. My face heated, but I forced myself to remain expressionless. Showing reaction would only encourage them. "Just get it done," Lieutenant Shepard said, turning back to her presentation as if I'd already been dismissed from her awareness. After the briefing ended, I was gathering up the equipment when Lynch approached with Wilcox and Cassidy flanking him like bodyguards. They positioned themselves so I'd have to squeeze past them to reach the door, a subtle but deliberate blocking maneuver. "Having trouble keeping up with the workload?" Lynch asked, his tone mock sympathetic. "I know civilian employees aren't used to the pace we maintain around here." "I'm managing fine," I replied evenly, reaching for the projector case. "Doesn't look that way to me," Wilcox chimed in. "Looks like you're struggling with basic filing. That's pretty embarrassing." I straightened up, meeting Lynch's eyes. "Is there something specific you need, Officer Lynch? I have work to get back to." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Surprise that I'd responded directly, maybe, or irritation that I hadn't simply accepted the humiliation. Then his face settled back into his usual smirk. "Just trying to be helpful," he said. "Wouldn't want you to get overwhelmed and quit. Finding good help is so hard these days." The emphasis on good help made it clear what he thought of my competence. They finally moved aside and I carried the equipment out of the briefing room. But as I walked down the corridor, I heard Cassidy's voice behind me. "Think she'll last another month?" Lynch's response was just loud enough for me to hear. "Probably not. They never do." That afternoon brought a new form of harassment. I was working in the records office when my desk tone rang. I answered professionally, but the voice on the other end was Lynch. "Yeah, I need you to pull the Martinez file from last year. Bring it up to the squad room." "Which Martinez case?" I asked. It was a common name, and there had been dozens of cases involving someone named Martinez. "Just figure it out." And he hung up.
I spent 20 minutes searching through files before realizing this was likely another test or joke at my expense. When I finally brought 3 different Martinez files to the squad room, Lynch was sitting at his desk talking to Wilcox. He glanced at the files I was carrying and shook his head. "Never mind. Already found what I needed. You can take those back." Wilcox snickered. I stood there for a moment, recognizing the game. He'd sent me on a purposeless errand just to waste my time and demonstrate his ability to make me jump through hoops. "Anything else?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Nope, that'll be all." He turned back to his conversation, dismissing me completely. As I walked back to the records office, I passed Sergeant Pollock in the hallway. He was carrying a coffee cup and gave me a look that suggested he'd witnessed the interaction or heard about it. "Don't let him get to you.
he said quietly as we passed. His words were meant to be encouraging, but they only confirmed what I already knew. The harassment was visible to others, and nobody was going to intervene. This was just how things worked at Northridge. The situation took a darker turn during my 6th week. I was alone in the evidence room, logging items that had been checked in earlier that day, when Lynch appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, blocking my exit, and watched me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're very thorough," he observed after a long silence. "It's important to be accurate with evidence documentation," I replied, not looking up from my work. "That's interesting, coming from someone who can't keep up with basic data entry." I set down my pen and turned to face him. "Was there something you needed from the evidence room, Officer Lynch?" He pushed off the doorframe and walked closer, his movements casual but deliberately invasive of my personal space. "I'm just curious about you, Brooks. You don't act like most temps we get around here. Most of them are just trying to collect a paycheck and avoid making waves. But you're different somehow." My heart rate increased, but I kept my expression calm. "I'm just here to do my job." See, that's what I mean. Most people would be intimidated by now, would have quit, or at least started avoiding any interaction with officers. But you keep showing up, keep doing your work, like none of this bothers you. He tilted his head, studying me. "Makes me wonder what you're really doing here." This was dangerous territory. If Lynch was starting to suspect I was more than I appeared, my entire investigation could be compromised. I needed to deflect without seeming defensive. "I need this job," I said simply, "and I've worked in difficult environments before. This isn't my first time dealing with people who don't think I belong." Something in my answer seemed to satisfy him. His suspicious expression relaxed back into the usual contempt. "Well, as long as you know your place, we won't have any problems. Just stay out of the way and do what you're told." He left, but the interaction stayed with me for the rest of the day. Lynch was more observant than I'd given him credit for. I'd need to be even more careful about maintaining my cover, even as the harassment continued to escalate. That night, sitting in my actual apartment across town, I filed my weekly report to my handler at Internal Affairs. The document was growing longer with each submission, filled with detailed accounts of policy violations, evidence of systemic harassment, and a culture that prioritized loyalty over accountability. But I also noted Lynch's growing attention and the risk it represented. If Lynch started actively investigating my background, there were layers of cover story in place, but nothing was foolproof. The best protection was to remain beneath his contempt, to be so unremarkable that scrutiny seemed unnecessary. As I encrypted and sent the report, I realized I was walking a razor's edge. I needed to document increasingly serious misconduct while simultaneously appearing too incompetent to pose any threat. It was exhausting, and I was only 6 weeks in. The worst, I suspected, was still ahead. Week 8 at Northridge Precinct started like any other Monday morning. I arrived early, made coffee for the break room, and settled into the records office to continue working through the mountain of paperwork that never seemed to diminish. The precinct was quiet in those early hours, with only a skeleton crew finishing up the night shift and a few early arrivals preparing for the day ahead. By 9 o'clock, the squad room had filled with the usual morning chaos. Officers coming on shift, exchanging information with those heading home, the ritual complaints about traffic and terrible coffee blending into the familiar background noise of precinct life. I was at the copy machine down the hall, duplicating a stack of reports that needed to be distributed to multiple departments. The copy machine at Northridge was ancient and temperamental, requiring constant attention to prevent paper jams. I was leaning over it, clearing yet another jam from the feed tray, when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Multiple sets, moving with the casual confidence of people who owned the space they walked through. "Can't even handle a copy machine without breaking it," Lynch's voice said, closer than I expected. I straightened up, turning to face him.
He was flanked by Wilcox and Cassidy, as usual, all three of them still in their patrol uniforms from the morning shift. Lynch was holding a stack of papers, apparently needing to use the machine I was currently occupying. "Just clearing a paper jam," I said. "Should be ready in a minute." "We don't have a minute," Lynch replied. "Some of us have actual police work to do." I stepped aside, gesturing to the machine. "It's all yours." But Lynch didn't move toward the copier. Instead, he looked me up and down with that familiar, contemptuous expression, as if trying to figure out what cosmic joke had placed someone so incompetent in his professional space. My hair was down that day, falling past my shoulders in loose waves. I'd been growing it out for months as part of my cover, letting myself look softer and less authoritative than my usual professional appearance. "You know what your problem is, Brooks?" Lynch said, moving closer. "You don't know when you're in the way." "I already stepped aside. The machine is free." "That's not what I mean." He stepped closer still, invading my personal space in a way that was clearly deliberate. "Your problem is you think you belong here. You think doing basic clerical work makes you part of this precinct." Wilcox and Cassidy had positioned themselves on either side, creating a semicircle that boxed me against the wall. Other officers were visible down the hallway, going about their business, well within earshot of this interaction. Nobody was intervening. "I'm just trying to do my job," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the adrenaline starting to spike through my system. "Your job is to stay out of our way and not slow us down." Then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed a handful of my hair. The move was so unexpected, so brazenly inappropriate, that for a split second, I couldn't process what was happening. His grip was firm, not quite painful, but absolutely controlling, pulling my head slightly to the side as he leaned in closer. "Maybe if you spent less time worrying about looking pretty and more time doing your actual job, sweetheart." In that moment, I could have ended everything. Could have identified myself, could have put Lynch on the ground with any of a dozen defensive techniques I'd been trained in, could have arrested him on the spot for assault. But doing so would blow my cover, compromise the entire investigation, and likely allow the systemic problems at Northridge to remain hidden and unaddressed. So instead, I did what Kendall Brooks, temporary administrative assistant, would do. I reached up slowly and removed his hand from my hair, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that showed no fear but also no challenge. "Please don't touch me," I said quietly. For a moment, Lynch looked almost disappointed that I hadn't given him the reaction he wanted. Then he laughed, a harsh sound that his buddies immediately echoed. "Sensitive, aren't we?" He stepped back, finally giving me space. "Just trying to be friendly. Guess that's too much to expect from someone who can't even keep a copy machine running." They walked away, their laughter echoing down the hallway. I stood there for several long seconds, my hands trembling slightly from the effort of maintaining control. When I looked around, I saw at least 5 other officers who had witnessed the entire interaction. Not one of them met my eyes. They simply went back to their work, as if what they'd just seen was so routine it didn't warrant acknowledgement. Sergeant Pollock appeared from around the corner, his weathered face set in hard lines. He'd seen it too. For a moment, I thought he might say something, might finally be the one person to acknowledge that what had just happened was completely unacceptable. But he just gave me a slight nod, his expression a mixture of sympathy and resignation, and continued past. I finished my copying on autopilot, my mind already working through the implications. Lynch had just committed assault in front of multiple witnesses, and nobody had intervened. That fact alone spoke volumes about the culture at Northridge. But more than that, he'd felt confident enough to do it, secure in the knowledge that there would be no consequences. I was wrong about one thing, though. There would be consequences, just not the kind he expected. Back in the records office, with the door closed and my hands finally steady, I pulled out my encrypted phone and documented everything. The exact time, the names of everyone present, Lynch's specific words, the physical assault, and most importantly, the complete lack of response from any witnessing officers. I took photos of my hair from multiple angles, showing where it had been disheveled from his grip.
Then I made a decision. This incident changed the timeline. What I had witnessed and experienced over the past 2 months, culminating in this morning's assault, was enough to justify moving to the next phase of the investigation. I drafted a message to my handler requesting authorization to engineer a crisis situation that would force the precinct's true nature into the open. The reply came back within an hour. Authorized. Proceed with extreme caution. Documentation must be ironclad. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of what came next settling onto my shoulders. Garrett Lynch thought he'd put me in my place this morning. He thought he'd demonstrated his power and control over someone he perceived as weak and unimportant. He had no idea that he'd just sealed his own fate and provided the catalyst that would bring down the corrupt culture he'd helped build. The hair he'd grabbed belonged to a decorated internal affairs detective who'd spent 8 weeks building an airtight case against him and his cronies. The game was about to change, and Garrett Lynch was going to learn exactly who he'd been dealing with all along.
The hair-grabbing incident became a turning point. Not because it stopped the harassment, but because it emboldened Lynch and his crew to escalate even further. In their minds, my failure to report or fight back confirmed what they'd believed all along. I was weak, powerless, and acceptable to abuse without consequence. Over the next 2 weeks, the mistreatment became more brazen and systematic. Files I needed would be deliberately hidden or moved. Equipment would malfunction mysteriously after Lynch or his friends had been near it. During briefings, my presence became a source of open mockery, with officers making jokes about the help being incompetent or slow. But what they didn't know was that every incident, every cruel comment, every act of sabotage was being meticulously documented. My black notebook had evolved into a comprehensive record of misconduct that went far beyond simple harassment. I was uncovering evidence of serious policy violations, evidence tampering, and a culture of impunity that extended from the patrol officers all the way up to precinct leadership. During my 9th week, while organizing evidence logs, I discovered something that made my investigation take on new urgency. There were gaps in the chain of custody documentation for several drug cases. Items checked into evidence weren't matching the amounts listed in arrest reports. The discrepancies were small enough that they might go unnoticed in a routine audit, but large enough to suggest systematic theft or tampering. I cross-referenced the cases and found a pattern. All of them had been handled by officers in Lynch's circle. All of them had gaps in documentation that occurred during specific shifts when the same evidence room supervisor was on duty, and all of them involved drugs that had street value. This was bigger than harassment. This was potential criminal activity happening under the cover of a dysfunctional system where nobody asked questions and nobody looked too closely at irregularities. I was photographing evidence logs with my phone when Jenna Flores appeared in the doorway of the evidence room. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Kendall, can I talk to you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Of course. What's wrong?" She hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to say what she'd come to say. Finally, she spoke. "I know you've been having trouble with Lynch and his friends. I wanted to warn you that it's probably going to get worse." "Why do you say that?" "Because I've seen this pattern before. There was another temp here about 2 years ago. Nice woman just trying to do her job. Lynch and his crew made her life miserable. She complained to Lieutenant Shepard, and instead of addressing the problem, they made her assignment end early, said she wasn't a good fit for the precinct environment." I absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture of systemic dysfunction. What happened to her? She left. Nobody knows where she went, but the message was clear to the rest of us. Don't make waves, don't complain, and definitely don't challenge the officers who run this place. Jenna's eyes were full of regret. I should have said something to support her. We all should have. But we were scared of becoming targets ourselves. "I appreciate you telling me this," I said gently. "There's more." Jenna lowered her voice even further. "I've noticed things in the evidence room. Inconsistencies in the logs. I think someone's been tampering with evidence, but I don't know who to tell. If I report it and I'm wrong, or if I'm right but nobody does anything, I'll lose my job."
This was the break I'd been hoping for. An insider who'd noticed the same problems I had and was willing to acknowledge them. Have you documented what you've seen? Some of it. But I'm scared, Kendall. These are cops. They have power and connections. What can someone like me do against that? I wanted desperately to tell her the truth, to reveal that she wasn't alone and that her observations were part of a larger investigation. But I couldn't risk compromising my cover, not when I was so close to having everything I needed. Keep your documentation safe, I said carefully. And if the right opportunity comes to speak up, don't be afraid to tell the truth. Sometimes that's all we can do. After Jenna left, I sat alone in the evidence room, surrounded by the physical manifestation of years of cases, arrests, and prosecutions. How many of these cases were tainted by the misconduct I was uncovering? How many defendants had legitimate grounds for appeal because evidence had been mishandled or tampered with? The scope of the problem at Northridge was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about a few bad officers harassing civilian employees. It was about a fundamental breakdown in accountability that was corrupting the core mission of law enforcement. That afternoon, I had another confrontation with Lynch. I was carrying a box of files down the hallway when he deliberately stepped into my path, forcing me to stop short to avoid collision. "Still here?" he said with mock surprise. "Thought you'd have quit by now. Most people with any sense would have." "I don't quit easily," I replied. "That's not persistence, sweetheart. That's just stubbornness, or maybe stupidity. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Let me give you some free advice. This precinct isn't a good fit for someone like you. You should probably start looking for work somewhere else. Somewhere easier." It was a threat, thinly veiled as friendly advice. He wanted me gone, and he was telling me that the harassment would continue until I left. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, stepping around him. His hand shot out and grabbed the box I was carrying, not taking it, but making it impossible for me to move forward. "I'm being serious. Bad things can happen to people who don't know when to leave." We stood there for a moment, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, he released the box and stepped aside. But the message had been clear. The harassment was escalating towards something more dangerous. Back in my apartment that night, I compiled my weekly report. 8 weeks of documentation had produced a damning picture of Northridge Precinct. I had evidence of harassment, assault, evidence tampering, falsified reports, and a command structure that either actively enabled the misconduct or deliberately looked the other way. But I also had a problem. The longer I stayed embedded, the more dangerous my situation became. Lynch was getting more aggressive, more threatening. If he decided to move beyond verbal intimidation and petty harassment to actual violence, I'd have to reveal myself to protect my own safety. That would end the investigation prematurely and potentially allow many of these issues to be buried. I needed a catalyst, something that would force Northridge's dysfunction into the open in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up. My handler and I had been discussing options, but nothing had felt quite right, until the emergency call came in 3 days later, and everything changed.
The emergency dispatch came through at 2:47 on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the records office, cross-referencing case files with evidence logs, when the alarm bells started ringing throughout the precinct. Within seconds, the building transformed from routine bureaucracy to controlled chaos. Officers rushed toward the squad room, pulling on tactical gear and checking weapons. Radios crackled with urgent communications. Through the open door, I could hear Lieutenant Shepard's voice cutting through the noise, sharp and commanding. I moved to the doorway, staying out of the way but positioning myself where I could observe what was happening. The squad room had filled with every available officer, their faces reflecting varying degrees of tension and anticipation. "Listen up." Lieutenant Shepard stood at the front of the room, a tactical map already displayed on the screen behind her. "We have an active hostage situation at the Riverside Bank on Morrison Street. 2 armed suspects, approximately 6 hostages, including bank employees and customers. Suspects are demanding a vehicle and safe passage. My pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes situation where a precinct's true capabilities and leadership would be tested. SWAT is 30 minutes out, Shepard continued. We're first response. Our job is to establish a perimeter, evacuate surrounding buildings, and maintain containment until SWAT arrives. This is not an entry situation. I repeat, we are not making entry. We contain and we wait for specialized units. She began assigning positions, and I watched the officers' reactions carefully. Some looked focused and professional. Others, including several in Lynch's circle, looked almost excited, like this was the kind of action they'd been waiting for. Lynch, you and Wilcox take the north perimeter. Cassidy, you're with Phillips on the south side. I want every access point covered and civilians cleared from a 2-block radius. The officers began moving out, grabbing equipment and heading for their vehicles. I retreated back into the records office, my mind racing. A hostage situation was extremely dangerous, and the way Northridge handled it would reveal everything about their actual competence versus their assumed authority. Through the window, I watched patrol cars screaming out of the parking lot, lights flashing and sirens wailing. The precinct emptied rapidly, leaving only skeleton staff and civilians like me behind. But I wasn't content to just wait for news. I had access to police radio frequencies through my actual IA credentials, and I quickly pulled out my personal phone and activated the encrypted scanner app. What I heard over the next 20 minutes was deeply troubling. The first problem was communication breakdown. Officers were talking over each other on the radio, creating confusion about who was positioned where. Lieutenant Shepard was trying to maintain control, but several officers were ignoring protocol and making their own decisions about positioning and approach. Then I heard Lynch's voice, tense with frustration. North perimeter secured. I have visual on the front entrance. No movement visible. Maintain position. SWAT ETA is now 20 minutes. 20 minutes is a long time. Hostages could be injured or killed while we're standing around waiting for SWAT. You have your orders, Lynch. Perimeter containment only. There was a pause, then Wilcox's voice. We could move to a better tactical position, get closer to the entrance, maybe establish direct line of sight. Negative, Shepard responded, her voice harder now. You maintain current position. No one moves closer without my direct authorization.
I listened with growing concern. Lynch and Wilcox were already pushing against their orders, looking for reasons to escalate their involvement. This was the swagger and overconfidence I'd been documenting for weeks, now playing out in a life-or-death situation. The situation deteriorated further when I heard Cassidy's voice. South perimeter, I've got movement in the building next to the bank. Could be a suspect trying to flank our position. Describe the movement, Shepard ordered. Individual in dark clothing, moving on the second floor. Can't get a clear visual. My stomach dropped. This was exactly how situations spiraled out of control. Officers seeing threats that might not exist, adrenaline overriding judgment, and a command structure that wasn't maintaining firm control. All units hold position, Shepard commanded. Do not engage unless you have positive identification of a threat. But the radio chatter continued, with officers reporting possible sightings and suspicious movements. The perimeter that was supposed to be calm and controlled was starting to feel chaotic and reactive. Then came the transmission that made everything worse. Lynch's voice, tight with tension. I have a clear shot through the bank's front window. I can see one of the suspects. If he makes a move toward the hostages, I might have an opportunity. Lynch, you are not authorized to take any shots. Shepard's voice was sharp with alarm. Your orders are containment only. Do you understand? Just saying, if the opportunity presents itself. There is no opportunity. You are not a trained sniper. You are not SWAT. You will maintain your position and wait for specialized units. Acknowledge your orders. A long pause, then reluctantly, acknowledged. I sat in the records office listening to this disaster unfold and realized something crucial. This crisis was revealing exactly what I'd suspected about Northridge. Officers who thought they were more capable than they actually were, a command structure struggling to maintain control, and a culture where following orders was treated as optional when it conflicted with an officer's personal judgment. But there was another problem emerging, one that was about to make everything much worse. The radio crackled with a new voice, Captain Townsend, who'd apparently arrived on scene. "This is Captain Townsend. I'm assuming incident command. Lieutenant Shepard, what's your current assessment?" Shepard's voice remained professional, but I could hear the strain. "Sir, we have perimeter established. SWAT is now 15 minutes out. Suspects are contained inside the bank with hostages. No shots fired, no injuries reported." 15 minutes is too long. Hostages are at risk every second we wait. I need to know if we have any officers with tactical entry experience. There was a pause, and then Lynch's voice, "Sir, I have advanced tactical training from my time in the Army. If you need someone who can assess entry options, I can do it." I was on my feet before I realized it, my hands clenched into fists. This was spiraling out of control. Lynch had no business making tactical entry assessments, and Captain Townsend was about to make a decision that could get people killed. But I wasn't there. I was stuck at the precinct, listening to a disaster unfold, and powerless to stop it, unless I did something that would blow my cover but might save lives. I grabbed my phone and made a decision that would change everything.
I made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The first was to my internal affairs handler, Detective Marcus Webb, informing him that I was terminating my undercover operation immediately due to imminent threat to civilian lives. The second was to the SWAT commander en route to the scene, identifying myself and providing critical information about the tactical situation. The third was to Commissioner Paul Driscoll himself, the highest-ranking officer in Summitview's police department. Then I grabbed my actual credentials from the locked compartment in my bag, along with the service weapon I'd kept hidden for the past 2 months, and headed for my car. The drive to Morrison Street took 8 minutes that felt like hours. My mind was racing through tactical scenarios, hostage negotiation protocols, and the mountain of evidence I'd compiled about Northridge's dysfunction. Everything was about to come into the open, and I just hoped I could prevent the situation from turning deadly. I arrived at the perimeter to find exactly the chaos I'd expected. Patrol cars were positioned haphazardly, officers were clustered in groups rather than maintaining proper coverage, and there was no clear command structure visible. I spotted Captain Townsend near a mobile command vehicle, surrounded by several officers, including Lynch. I walked directly toward them, my IA credentials displayed openly for the first time in 2 months. Several officers noticed me approaching, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they recognized the temp from the precinct, now carrying herself with unmistakable authority. "Captain Townsend," I called out, my voice carrying the command tone I'd been suppressing for weeks. "I need to speak with you immediately." Townsend turned, his face showing complete bewilderment. "Brooks, what are you doing here? This is a tactical situation. Civilians need to stay behind the perimeter." I held up my credentials. "Detective Kendall Brooks, Internal Affairs Division. I'm not a civilian, and I'm here to prevent you from making a catastrophic mistake." The reaction was instantaneous. Lynch's face went pale, then flushed red with anger and humiliation. Wilcox and Cassidy looked stunned. Other officers were staring, clearly trying to process what they just heard. "Internal Affairs?" Townsend's voice was sharp. "What the hell is going on?" "I've been embedded at Northridge Precinct for the past 2 months, conducting an investigation into misconduct and policy violations. But right now, that investigation is secondary to this hostage situation. Sir, you cannot authorize entry into that bank with your current personnel and resources." "I don't take operational orders from Internal Affairs," Townsend said, his face hardening. "Then take them from Commissioner Paul Driscoll himself, who I just briefed on this situation." I pulled out my phone and showed him the call log. He's on his way here now, and he's ordered that no entry be made until SWAT arrives and assumes command. Lynch stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "You've been lying to us for 2 months, pretending to be some incompetent temp while spying on us?" "I've been documenting systematic misconduct, harassment, and policy violations, including your assault on me last week when you grabbed my hair in front of multiple witnesses.
I met his eyes directly, which, by the way, is on record with photographs and witness statements. The color drained from Lynch's face. Around us, other officers were watching with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. Not everyone at Northridge is corrupt, and some of them were clearly pleased to see Lynch taken down.
"This is insane," Lynch sputtered. "Captain, you can't seriously be listening to this. She's been lying from day one. How can you trust anything she says?" "Because she's right about the tactical situation," a new voice said. Everyone turned to see Sergeant Raymond Pollock approaching, his weathered face grave. "Captain, I've been on the force 28 years. I've seen hostage situations go bad. We don't have the training or equipment for entry operations. If we go in there without proper support, people will die." Townsend looked between me, Pollock, and the bank. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. His authority was being challenged, but the alternative was taking responsibility if the situation went wrong. "SWAT is now 10 minutes out," I said firmly. 10 minutes is nothing compared to the consequences of a botched entry. Let the professionals handle this. Before Townsend could respond, the radio crackled with a new transmission. "This is SWAT Commander Price. We're 3 minutes from the scene. All units maintain current positions and await our arrival for command transition." The decision had been made for him. Townsend's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "All units, hold your positions. SWAT is taking over." Lynch looked like he wanted to argue, but the fight had gone out of him. He was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, clearly still processing that the woman he'd been harassing and assaulting for 2 months was actually a decorated detective. SWAT arrived minutes later, a professional team that moved with practiced efficiency. They established proper command, assessed the situation, and within 40 minutes had successfully negotiated the suspect's surrender without a single shot fired. All hostages were released unharmed. As the situation wound down, Commissioner Driscoll arrived with my IA handler, Detective Webb. Driscoll was a tall man in his 60s with iron gray hair and the kind of presence that made people stand straighter when he walked into a room. He surveyed the scene, then turned to me. "Detective Brooks, I want a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning. Everything you've documented at Northridge." "Yes, sir. It's already compiled and ready for review." He looked at Captain Townsend. "Captain, you and I need to have a conversation about command decisions and why you were about to authorize an entry operation against all protocols and training." Townsend's face was gray. "Sir, I was trying to protect civilian lives. You were trying to look decisive, and you nearly got people killed doing it. We'll discuss this further." Driscoll turned to Lynch and his crew. "Officers Lynch, Wilcox, and Cassidy, you're all on administrative leave effective immediately pending investigation. Turn in your badges and weapons." "On what grounds?" Lynch demanded, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "On the grounds that Detective Brooks has documented multiple incidents of misconduct, harassment, and assault, all of which will be thoroughly investigated." Driscoll's voice was ice cold. "You're done here." As Lynch, Wilcox, and Cassidy were escorted away by IA officers, I felt the weight of 2 months lifting off my shoulders. The investigation was over. The truth was finally in the open, and Northridge Precinct was about to face a reckoning it had been avoiding for years. But as I watched Lynch being led away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt exhausted and sad that it had taken an undercover operation and a near disaster to force accountability on a system that should have been policing itself all along.
The interrogation room at Internal Affairs Headquarters was deliberately austere. Gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, uncomfortable chairs, and a recording system that captured every word and gesture. I'd been on both sides of this table before, but sitting across from Officer Garrett Lynch as his world collapsed around him was a particular kind of vindication I'd been waiting 2 months to experience. Lynch sat with his arms crossed, his lawyer beside him, trying to maintain the swagger and confidence that had defined his persona at Northridge, but I could see the cracks. The way his jaw was clenched too tight, the slight tremor in his hands that he was trying to hide, the realization in his eyes that he'd fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with.
For the record, I began, my voice professional and detached, this is Detective Kendall Brooks conducting an interview with Officer Garrett Lynch regarding incidents that occurred during an internal affairs investigation at Northridge Precinct. I stated the date and time, then looked directly at Lynch. Officer Lynch, you've been read your rights and you have legal counsel present. Do you understand? I understand, he said, his voice tight. Let's start with the incident on Monday, October 9th at approximately 9:15 a.m. You physically grabbed my hair while I was using the copy machine on the second floor. Is that correct? His lawyer leaned in. My client disputes the characterization of that interaction as assault. It was a momentary touch during a casual conversation. I pulled out my tablet and brought up a video file. This is security camera footage from the hallway adjacent to the copy room. The camera angle doesn't show the actual contact, but it clearly shows Officer Lynch, Officer Wilcox, and Officer Cassidy surrounding me, blocking my exit. It shows the body language of all three officers as aggressive and intimidating, and it shows me stepping back after the contact occurred. I paused the video on a frame that showed Lynch's arm extended toward me, his hand at the level of my head. We also have witness statements from 5 officers who observed this interaction. 3 of them have confirmed that you grabbed my hair. Are you prepared to contradict sworn statements from your fellow officers? Lynch's face flushed. They don't understand the context. It wasn't meant to be threatening. How exactly should someone interpret having their hair grabbed by a male officer who outweighs them by 70 pounds while 2 other male officers block their exit? I let the question hang in the air. Help me understand what non-threatening interpretation exists for that scenario. His lawyer intervened again. Detective, is there a specific question you're asking my client? I'm asking him to explain his actions, but let's move on to the pattern of behavior that led up to that incident. I pulled out my black notebook, the same one I'd carried throughout my time at Northridge. Over the course of 8 weeks, I documented 43 separate incidents of harassment, intimidation, or professional sabotage directed at me. 27 of those incidents involved you directly, Officer Lynch. I began reading entries. Week 2, you sent me on a deliberately false errand to retrieve a case file that didn't exist. Week 3, you and Officer Cassidy blocked my path in the hallway and made demeaning comments about civilian employees. Week 4, you ordered me to make coffee specifically to your preferences, then threw it away, claiming it was undrinkable, and made me make it again. Week 5, this is ridiculous, Lynch interrupted. You're talking about normal workplace interactions. Everyone gets hazed a little bit. That's how you know if someone can handle the pressure. Hazing? I set down the notebook. Officer Lynch, I'm a decorated detective with 12 years of service. I've handled undercover operations in gang territories, worked major crimes, and received 3 commendations for bravery. I don't need to prove I can handle pressure. But let's talk about your behavior towards someone you believed was a temporary administrative employee with no power to fight back.
I leaned forward. That's what this really comes down to, isn't it? You believed I was powerless. You believed there would be no consequences for treating me with contempt, for physically assaulting me, for creating a hostile work environment. And do you know why you believed that? Lynch didn't answer, but his expression had shifted from defiance to something closer to fear. You believed it because that's the culture at Northridge, because you'd been getting away with this kind of behavior for years, because leadership either actively enabled it or turned a blind eye. I pulled out another document. I have statements from 4 other civilian employees who reported harassment by you and other officers. Every single complaint was dismissed or resulted in the civilian being quietly removed from the precinct. His lawyer was taking notes frantically now, clearly recognizing how bad this was for his client. There's also the matter of the evidence room discrepancies, I continued, shifting topics. During my investigation, I discovered irregularities in chain of custody documentation for 17 different cases.
cases that you and your team had access to during specific shifts. Can you explain those irregularities? I don't know anything about evidence room problems, Lynch said quickly. That's not my responsibility. But you did have access, and the pattern of discrepancies corresponds directly with your shift rotations. I pulled out more documentation. We've initiated a full audit of the evidence room. If there's been tampering or theft, we'll find it. I wanted to give you the opportunity to cooperate with that investigation. The room fell silent. Lynch's lawyer whispered something to him, and I could see Lynch weighing his options. Cooperation might earn him leniency, but it would also mean admitting to serious misconduct. My client has nothing further to say at this time, the lawyer finally announced. I nodded, having expected this. That's your right, but understand that this investigation is ongoing. We have documentation, witness statements, video evidence, and physical evidence of assault. We have a pattern of behavior that extends back years, and we have a department that's finally willing to take these issues seriously. I stood up. You thought you were untouchable, Officer Lynch? You thought the badge gave you the right to treat people however you wanted without consequence. You were wrong. As I left the interrogation room, I felt a grim satisfaction. Lynch was facing suspension without pay, potential criminal charges for assault, and likely termination. But more importantly, his case was sending a message throughout Summitview's police department that the old way of doing things was over. Later that day, I sat in Commissioner Driscoll's office delivering my full report. The document was over 200 pages, detailing not just Lynch's misconduct, but systemic issues at Northridge that had allowed such behavior to flourish. This is damning, Driscoll said, flipping through pages. Command failures, inadequate oversight, a culture of impunity. Captain Townsend is finished. Lieutenant Shepard will face disciplinary action, and we're going to have to review every case that came through Northridge during this period. Yes, sir. The defense bar is going to have a field day with the evidence room issues alone. Driscoll looked at me with something approaching respect. You did good work here, Detective. I know it wasn't easy. No, sir, it wasn't. I thought about the 2 months of being treated as less than human, of biting my tongue while being insulted and demeaned, of watching officers abuse their authority while I could do nothing but document it. The reckoning at Northridge had begun, and nothing would ever be the same.
3 weeks after my identity was revealed, I returned to Northridge Precinct for the first time since the hostage situation. The building looked the same from the outside, but I knew everything inside had fundamentally changed. Captain Townsend had been reassigned to a desk position pending retirement. Lieutenant Shepard was on suspension. And the investigation into evidence room irregularities had expanded to involve the district attorney's office. I walked through those same glass doors, but this time wearing my actual detective's badge and carrying myself with the authority I'd hidden for so long. The officer at the front desk, the same one who'd barely looked at me 2 months ago, immediately stood at attention. Detective Brooks, they're expecting you in the conference room. The precinct felt different, quieter somehow, more careful. Officers I passed in the hallway met my eyes with expressions ranging from respect to embarrassment to barely concealed resentment. I'd become the symbol of everything that had been wrong at Northridge and the reckoning that followed. The conference room was filled with people. Commissioner Driscoll sat at the head of the table, flanked by my IA handler, Detective Webb, and 2 representatives from the police union. But what surprised me was seeing several Northridge officers present, including Sergeant Pollock and Officer Jenna Flores. And sitting near the back, looking profoundly uncomfortable, was Officer Garrett Lynch. He'd been allowed back into the precinct for this meeting as part of the investigation process, though he was still on administrative leave. His face was drawn, his usual confidence completely absent. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, unable to hold my gaze. Commissioner Driscoll called the meeting to order.
We're here today to review the findings from Detective Brooks's investigation and discuss implementation of reforms at Northridge Precinct. Detective Brooks, would you present your recommendations? I stood and distributed copies of my reform proposal. The investigation revealed that Northridge's problems stemmed from three core failures: inadequate leadership oversight, a culture that discouraged reporting of misconduct, and a lack of accountability for officers who violated policy and procedure. I outlined specific recommendations: mandatory anti-harassment training for all personnel, civilian oversight of evidence handling, regular anonymous surveys to assess workplace culture, clear reporting mechanisms for misconduct that bypass chain of command, and consequences that were applied consistently, regardless of an officer's tenure or connections. These reforms are designed to ensure that what happened to me and to other civilian employees before me can never happen again. But more importantly, they're designed to restore public trust in this precinct. After my presentation, Commissioner Driscoll opened the floor for discussion. Several officers spoke about the need for change. Sergeant Pollock, in particular, gave a powerful statement about watching dysfunction flourish because he felt powerless to challenge it alone. Then Lynch raised his hand. The room fell silent. "I'd like to say something," he began, his voice unsteady. "If that's allowed." Driscoll nodded. "Go ahead." Lynch stood, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at me for the first time with something other than anger or resentment. It looked like genuine shame. "Detective Brooks, I owe you an apology. Not just a professional apology, but a real one. For 2 months, I treated you like you were beneath me. I harassed you, I physically assaulted you, and I created an environment where others felt it was acceptable to do the same. I did all of this because I believed you were powerless to stop me."
The room was absolutely silent. Learning that you were internal affairs, that you'd been documenting everything, it was humiliating. I was angry at first, felt betrayed, like you'd tricked us. He shook his head. But I've had 3 weeks to think about what really happened. You didn't trick us. You gave us every opportunity to treat you with basic human dignity. And we chose not to. That's on me. That's on all of us who participated in that culture. I watched him carefully, trying to assess whether this was genuine remorse or performance for the brass. "I've been a cop for 10 years, Lynch continued. I thought I was good at my job. I thought the badge meant I'd earned respect automatically. But you showed me that respect has to be earned through actions, not demanded through authority." He looked around the room. "I don't know if I'll be allowed to continue as an officer. Maybe I shouldn't be. But if I am, I promise that I'll never treat another person the way I treated you, and I'll hold myself and my fellow officers to a higher standard." He sat down, and I could see that several officers were visibly moved by his words. Wilcox and Cassidy, also present, were nodding in agreement. After the meeting ended, several officers approached me privately. Officer Phillips, the young officer who'd been ridiculed for asking questions in briefings, shook my hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing us that it's possible to stand up to the old way of doing things." Jenna Flores hugged me, tears in her eyes. "I've worked here for 6 years feeling invisible and powerless. You changed that, not just for me, but for everyone." Even some of the officers who'd been part of Lynch's circle made efforts to apologize and acknowledge their role in the toxic culture. Not all of them seemed entirely sincere, but the fact that they felt compelled to make the effort spoke to how completely the power dynamics had shifted. As I was leaving, Lynch caught up with me in the parking lot. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, two people who'd been locked in an adversarial relationship, now trying to figure out what came next. "I meant what I said in there. The apology, the commitment to change. I know you probably don't believe me." "I don't need to believe you. What matters is whether you believe yourself and whether your actions match your words going forward." He nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something?
During those 2 months, when I was treating you so badly, did you ever want to just reveal who you were and shut me down? Every single day, I admitted, especially after you grabbed my hair. But my job wasn't about personal vindication, it was about documenting a pattern so the system could be fixed. You made that pattern easy to document, he said with bitter humor. You did, but you weren't the only problem. You were a symptom of a culture that had lost its way. I met his eyes. The question now is whether people like you can be part of the solution instead of the problem. I'd like to try, if I get the chance. I didn't respond, just nodded and headed for my car. Whether Lynch and others at Northridge could truly change remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, there was accountability, oversight, and a recognition that the badge came with responsibility, not immunity.
6 months after the conclusion of my investigation, I stood in Commissioner Driscoll's office receiving my new assignment. Through the window behind his desk, I could see the Summitview skyline glittering in the afternoon sun. The city looked peaceful from this height, orderly and manageable. But I knew better. Every precinct, every department, every institution had its own culture and its own blind spots. Eastbridge District, Driscoll said, sliding a file across his desk. We've been getting complaints about excessive force and evidence handling irregularities. Nothing as systematic as what you uncovered at Northridge, but concerning enough that we need eyes on the inside. I picked up the file and flipped through it. A new precinct, a new identity, a new opportunity to expose dysfunction before it became corruption. When do I start? 2 weeks. That gives you time to wrap up the Northridge testimony and prepare your cover. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. How are you holding up? These undercover operations take a toll. I'm managing, I said, which was mostly true. The nightmares about being back in that records office, powerless and dismissed, had decreased in frequency. The anger I'd carried for weeks after the investigation concluded had mellowed into something more productive. I'd learned to process what I'd experienced and channel it into motivation for the next assignment. Before you move on to Eastbridge, I wanted to give you an update on Northridge. Thought you'd want to know how things have developed. I sat forward, genuinely curious. I'd been deliberately avoiding information about the precinct, wanting to maintain professional distance now that my role there was complete. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't interested in whether the reforms had taken root. Captain Douglas Hartley has been assigned as the new precinct commander. He's former internal affairs himself, knows exactly what to look for. Lieutenant Sharon Vaughn replaced Shepard. She's tough but fair, and she's making it clear that the old way of doing things is over. And Lynch? I asked, unable to help myself. He completed a formal disciplinary process, suspended without pay for 3 months, mandatory counseling and retraining, and he's on probation for the next 2 years. Any further misconduct, and he's terminated. Driscoll paused. He requested to speak at roll calls about his experience. Apparently, he's been pretty open about what he did and why it was wrong, using himself as an example of how not to be a cop. I absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Part of me wanted to believe Lynch's transformation was genuine. Another part remained skeptical that someone could change so fundamentally. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe what mattered was that the system now held people accountable, regardless of whether they changed. The evidence room audit found irregularities in 38 cases. 16 of those have resulted in charges being dropped or convictions overturned. It's a black eye for the department, but it's better than letting wrongful convictions stand. What about the civilian employees, Jenna Flores and the others? Flores was promoted to evidence supervisor. She's implementing new protocols that should prevent the kind of gaps you identified. The other civilian staff have been offered counseling and the opportunity to transfer if they want. Most are staying. They say the environment has improved dramatically. I felt a genuine sense of satisfaction at that.
The investigation hadn't just been about punishing misconduct. It had been about creating a workplace where people could do their jobs without fear of harassment or retaliation. "There's one more thing," Driscoll said, pulling out another document. "We're implementing your recommendations department-wide. Every precinct will undergo cultural assessments. Every officer will receive updated training on workplace conduct and accountability. And we're establishing an independent civilian review board with real authority to investigate complaints." "That's significant," I said, genuinely impressed.
It's necessary. What you uncovered at Northridge wasn't an isolated problem. It was a symptom of systemic issues we've been ignoring for too long. He looked at me seriously. Your willingness to embed yourself in that environment, to endure what you endured in order to document the truth, that's what made this possible. The department owes you a debt. I shook my head. The department doesn't owe me anything. I was doing my job. The people who were harassed and abused before me, the civilians who filed complaints that were ignored, they're the ones who deserve recognition. After leaving Driscoll's office, I made one final stop before moving on to my next assignment. I drove to Northridge Precinct, parking across the street and watching officers come and go during shift change. The building looked the same, but I knew the culture inside had fundamentally changed. Sergeant Pollock emerged from the main entrance, spotted my car, and walked over. I rolled down the window. "Heard you're heading to Eastbridge," he said. "Word travels fast." "It does in this department." He smiled. "Wanted to thank you before you left. What you did here, it gave people like me permission to speak up, to demand better. The old guard fought it at first, but they're realizing they're outnumbered now." "That's good to hear." "There's a new rookie class starting next month. Captain Hartley is having them review your investigation as part of their training, showing them what happens when culture goes wrong and what it takes to fix it." He paused. "You're going to be a legend in this department, Brooks. The detective who went undercover and took down an entire precinct's corruption." I grimaced. I'd rather not be a legend. I'd rather just be someone who did their job. Sometimes they're the same thing. He stepped back from the car. "Stay safe out there." As I drove away from Northridge for the last time, I reflected on what the past 6 months had taught me. Systems don't change because of policy memos or good intentions. They change because someone is willing to document the truth, endure the consequences, and hold people accountable. Garrett Lynch had grabbed the wrong woman's hair that day in the hallway. He'd thought he was asserting dominance over a powerless civilian. Instead, he'd set in motion a chain of events that would transform an entire precinct and send ripples through the whole department. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Webb. "Your new cover identity for Eastbridge is ready. Rebecca Martinez, probationary records clerk. Sound familiar?" I smiled. Another precinct, another identity, another opportunity to be underestimated. Some people might see it as punishment, spending months being treated as invisible and incompetent, but I'd learned that being underestimated was the greatest advantage an investigator could have. People revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. And I would be watching, documenting and building the case that would eventually bring truth to light. The work was never finished. There would always be another Northridge, another Lynch, another culture that needed to be exposed and reformed. But that was fine. I'd found my calling in those records offices and break rooms, in those moments of casual cruelty that revealed institutional rot. As I merged onto the highway heading toward my next assignment, I allowed myself one final thought about Northridge. The precinct would never be perfect. No institution could be. But it was better now than it had been. More accountable, more just, more aware that the badge came with responsibility, not immunity. And that would have to be enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.